Good morning, First Baptist Church. I'm in my office and recording for this Sunday morning's message. There's been some sickness in the Prineville home, and so I so appreciate Brother Paul pitching in and getting this recorded for this morning, as well as the Sunday evening message, which is already online. But pray for the Prineville family. Pray for several others that either have illness in their home or have family members with illness. And in some cases, it's the coronavirus, and other cases, it's just some other health issues as well. And so in this season and this longevity pandemic that we're going through, hang in there, be found faithful. I have a couple of announcements on this Sunday morning to give to you before we get started. By the way, if you want to get situated with your Bible, 1 Samuel 27 is where we're going to be this morning. 1 Samuel 27. On my desk is a huge stack of bulletins. This is probably 1/3 of the bulletins that we have not used. This is getting ready to go in the trash can. And again, another service tomorrow is being canceled in person. Because of just trying to protect the health of others as we gather together. And so we don't want to cause any situation where someone is, their health is compromised. So let's continue to pray for one another. I have also a trophy. I forgot to mention this last Sunday message. Last weekend, our girls came back from a tournament. Girls to guys, I believe. But anyway, our girls took second place. And so this is their trophy there. So congratulations, ladies, once again, and finishing well. Her great comments about the testimony, the zeal that you had, just your attitude. And so thank you so much for representing Christ very well. There is a teen Christmas party that we are going to have at the church, and that is Friday the 11th, December the 11th, I believe is the date there. But any questions, please see Sharon or Trevor regarding that. And then the following day, that Saturday morning, there's a men's prayer meeting here at the church at 8:30. And then what we're going to do that 12th, the 13th, Sunday the 13th, is we're going to, right after church is over on a Sunday morning, we're going to go Christmas caroling. I want you to plan to come with us. We're going to try to organize several different homes of folks that have not been here, some of our older members particularly, and go just do some Christmas caroling in their home right after church. So we'll load up in groups and just give addresses out and say, hey, these 5 cars meet us over here, these 6 cars meet us over here, and we'll arrange all that. And the reason why I want to do it on the 13th, in case it's raining, then we can postpone it 1 week to the 20th. But if I wait till the 20th and it's raining, then either we have to cancel it or get wet, one or the other. And so plan to go Christmas caroling with this Sunday right after the morning service, just for 30, 40 minutes or something like that. You'll still be able to hit lunch, okay? So don't worry about that. I got an interesting email last week. Back in the late 40s, there was a gentleman who pastored this church, Pastor Krell, 1948 to 1950. Anyway, his daughter, who is very elderly right now, had emailed me she's putting together a family booklet with their lineage, with their history, and she could not remember certain dates and things. And so I went through this morning, some of our annual business meeting notes, as well as the historical book that was put together back, I believe it was 2000. I'm not quite sure the year, maybe 2010. But nevertheless, I looked through some of those things and were able to provide the dates as well as some memories for her. And I was just thanking the Lord as I was perusing through business meeting notes. I saw men and women who are no longer with us, just years gone by of just their faithfulness. And I'm so thankful for our church. I'm so thankful for the lineage, the heritage, the blessings it is to be a part of this church. And I hope that you are thankful for being a part of this church this morning. 1 Samuel 27 is where we want to be this morning. The title of the message is The Pillage of the Village. the pillage of the village. Here in 1 Samuel, some people get 1 Samuel confused with 2 Samuel, and the way to differentiate the two is 1 Samuel is primarily about King Saul. 2 Samuel is primarily about King David. Now, there's some differences and some, even Saul is mentioned a little bit in 2 Samuel, and David is mentioned obviously in 1 Samuel, but that is what it is. Now, historically speaking, this was all one book, 1 and 2 Samuel. But the era that we're dealing with here in 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel is called the United Kingdom. It involves the first three kings of Israel. That's Saul, David, and Solomon. After the United Kingdom, Solomon's son, Rehoboam, divided the kingdom. And that's when you see Israel and Judah. So that era, all the kings in the Chronicles, deals with the divided kingdom. That's what the era is called. And you have all these different kings that did right and did wrong and such. But the United Kingdom is when they are what we're dealing with here. One nation, and God has selected a ruler, Saul. The era ends with the rejection of a ruler, and that's Rehoboam. I'm going to give you a neat outline, if I do say so myself, this morning, summarizing the whole book of 1 Samuel. Now, our text is in 1 Samuel 27, but I want to summarize the whole book this morning, just really in a brief nutshell. The first 11 chapters deals with the rise of Saul. The nation of Israel looked at the other nations, and they had kings, and so they said, we want a king and be like the other nations. And they were warned about, hey, here's the drawbacks, the negative sides of having a king. And they said, we don't care, we want to have a king. And so Saul was chosen. Not only do we see the rise of Saul, but we see the rejection of Saul. Soon after Saul became king, he was confronted with a battle. He was against the Philistines, the nemesis of Israel. And the Bible says that they were in a strait. They didn't know what to do. Well, they were waiting for Samuel, the prophet, to come, and Saul was impatient. So instead of waiting for the prophet to come back, he took matters in his own hands, and he acted and did things that only a priest was supposed to do. And God said, because you did that, I am going to reject you and replace you with another man. So not only do we see the rise of Saul, the rejection of Saul, but then the replacement of Saul. That's chapters 14, 15, and 16. And of course, that is the story of David, the shepherd boy, being anointed to be the next ruler. Then we see the reputation of David. This covers the next two chapters, chapters 17 and 18. And if you know anything about Scripture, particularly 1 Samuel 17, that's the battle, the famous battle of David and Goliath. And David gains this reputation of, and people are chanting, Saul has slain his thousands, David has tens of thousands. And so he begins this popularity, and Saul viewed it as a contest. He was used to getting all the attention, but now this David is doing it. So he eyed David from that day forward. Well, then we not only see the reputation of David, but we see the refusal of David by Saul. Saul, who envied and eyed David, tried several times, even though he promised David, I'm not going to harm you. He tried several times to kill David, throwing javelins at him, searching him, taking his soldiers out night, destroying his family relationships and pitting them against, using them against him. Trying to destroy David by bargaining his daughters. I mean, all sorts of things that Saul was trying to do and refusing David, trying to get rid of David. And that's chapters 19 through 23. Well, chapters 24 and 25 deal with the relationships of David, particularly with Nabal and Abigail. Nabal and Abigail were husband and wife, but Nabal was this drunkard, rude, crude, socially unacceptable man. And David had helped him out, and David was expecting Nabal to help him out. And Nabal said, no way, I'm not going to do that. So David was going to kill the guy. Abigail, in her wisdom, did some things to help David not do that. And as a consequence of some things, Nabal ends up dying, and David marries Abigail as a wife. Well, then we see the refuge of David in the Philistine territory. And that actually takes us through chapters 26 through the end of the chapter, through the end of the book, through 31. And that's where our text is right here. Well, we're in chapter 27, but the previous chapter, chapter 26, we see David forgoes. David, still on the run from Saul, has an attempt at least one time, but has an opportunity to kill King Saul. He goes into the camp and he sees Saul sleeping, and one of his staff members begs David, says, let me take care of this guy. And David says, no, we're not going to touch the Lord's anointed. And so he forgoes that opportunity. So not only do we see that David forgoes, but we see that David feigns. David feigns, and that's chapter 27. David is going to feign or act or pretend to be something or to say something or to do something that's really not within character. Well, you say, what do you mean? Well, so let's divide up this chapter specifically into a separate outline. First of all, we see David's departure. Now, hang with me. It's so essential to get the background, the historical background, before I actually give the applications of the message. So hang with me. Please watch this. Watch David's departure. Look at chapter 27, verse 1. And David said in his heart, I shall now perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me that I should speedily escape into the land of the Philistines, and Saul shall despair of me to seek me any more in any coast of Israel. So shall I escape out of his hand. This was David's idea. David had been running from Saul for quite some time, for a couple of years actually, and just got exhausted. And in his mind, this is a way out. Well, did his plan work? Look at verse 4. And it was told Saul that David was fled to Gath, and he sought no more again for him. His plan worked. His plan was to get away from the pressure of life against Saul and just flee to the Philistines, to a place where he knew that Saul wouldn't chase him. And it worked. But folks, how many times have we tried to come up with a scheme in our life to ease the pain, to ease the discomfort, and then all of a sudden it works out, and we call it God's will. And but here's David, and he's fleeing to the Philistines, and so that is the departure. But the rest of the chapter, verses 5 through 12, deal with David's deceit. David's deceit. I want you to watch how David deceives, who he deceives, and what he does to deceive. So we see, first of all, the facts. The facts. Look with me at verse number 5. David said unto Achish. Now stop there. Achish is a prince. You see that at the end of verse 2, it says, Achish, the son of Maoch, king of Gath. So if Maoch's the king of Gath and Achish is the son of a king, he's the prince. So David strikes up this relationship with the prince of the Philistines, and he says unto him, again, back in verse 5, if I have found grace in thine eyes, let them give me a place in some town in the country, that I may dwell there. For why should thy servant dwell in the royal city with thee? Do you get David's smooth talking request here? He's saying, Achish, you're royal. You're majestic. I don't deserve, me and my hundreds of men, to be under in this same city as you. Just give us some remote village off the side so we're not bothering you because we don't deserve what you deserve. Now, David was up to something because he really did not want to be scrutinized in the city under the leadership of Achish. And so he requests this city, and Achish falls for it and gives him a city called Ziklag. Well, look at verse number 6. Then Achish gave him Ziklag that day, wherefore Ziklag pertaineth to the kings of Judah unto this day. And the time that David dwelt in the country of the Philistines, watch this, was a full year and 4 months. Folks, 16 months of David's life was in the Philistine territory. 16 months of the people that hung with David, their life, their families were altered because David made a decision to flee, to depart from his land and to go to the Philistine country and be there those 16 months. Look at verse number 8. And David and his men went up and invaded the Geshurites and the Gezrites and the Amalekites, for those nations were of old the inhabitants of the land, as thou goest to Shur, even unto the land of Egypt. Now, David is destroying and annihilating and pillaging the villages down south of the people that Joshua years and years ago, and really his successors, were supposed to destroy. When God said to go into Canaan and possess the land, they did mostly, but they could not conquer everyone. Well, David's going through these villages and conquering them, and he's going to lead Achish to believe something else, though. Look what verse number 8 says. Verse 9. And David smote the land and left neither man nor woman alive. And he took away the sheep and the oxen and the asses and the camels and the apparel, and returned and came to Achish. So he is not only killing and annihilating any witnesses or people who can bring word back to Achish what he is actually doing. Now he's going to go back to the king, to the prince, Achish, and tell him one thing, but it's not really what has happened. So those are the facts. Let's now look at the fiction. What does he tell the prince, Achish? What's going on? Well, look at verse 10. And Achish said, whither have ye made a road today? Today we would say, hey, what'd you do today? Well, if my wife asked me today, what'd you do today? I could just generalize it and say, I was out and about. And not give her specifics like, I went to Walmart, I went to the hospital and visited someone, I visited these people, I made these phone calls, I cleaned 4 restrooms, I did, and not give her specifics, just said, I was out and about. It wouldn't necessarily be lying, but it'd be generalizing. Well, David's going to generalize something, but he's purposely going to leave out some facts because he's trying to deceive Achish, the prince. He's going to lead Achish to believe, I am pillaging the villages of the Jews. I am running from the Jews, and now I'm going to pillage their villages. But that's not what he's doing. He's annihilating the allies of the Philistines. And they don't know it because he's destroying anybody who could get word back to them. Look at verse number 10 again. And Achish said, whither have you made a road today? David said, against the south of Judah, against the south of Jerahmeelites, and against the south of the Kenites. Verse 11, David saved neither man or woman alive to bring tidings to Gath. And what would the tidings be if he allowed anybody to survive, lest they should tell on us, saying, so did David, and so will be his manner all the while he dwelleth in the country of Philistines. He did not want word to get back to Achish saying he's going to destroy all the allies at all. So he made sure he annihilated everybody. Now watch verse 12. And Achish believed David, saying, he hath made his people, Israel, utterly to abhor him. Therefore shall he be my bodyguard or servant forever. Well, Achish is believing the deceit, the fabrication that David has told him, and David's really pillaging the villages, destroying the chances of any word to get back. And by the way, First Chronicles tells us that during this time, when he's doing that, word gets back to the people of Judah, and some of the people who were under the leadership of King Saul defected, and they had heard that David was destroying the enemies, and they defected and joined David's army. While David is gone, the 16 months, his troops begin to swell, and he gains more and more people, which seemingly would be God's will. Well, so he leads Achish to believe this. Well, the next several chapters, which we're not going to focus in on, let me just highlight it. Chapters 28, 29, 30, and 31 deal with David's deliverance. David's deliverance. You say, what do you mean? Well, chapter 28 is the story where Saul is going to go to the medium. He's going to go to the Philistines, and the Israelites are against each other again in another battle, and he doesn't know what to do, Saul. And so Saul goes to the witch at Endor, and he tries to get some advice from them. So not only we see the medium, but chapter 29, we see the mistrust, where David, since the Philistines are gathering their troops to go against the Israelites, David volunteers, for some reason, we're not told specifically, volunteers to fight with the Philistines against Israel. Well, the Philistine lords, the mayors and the governors and such, they get together and say, no, he's not coming with us. And Achish said, well, he's believable. We could trust him. And the guy said, no. So while David is attempting to join the forces, and again, we're not told why he was doing that. Maybe he was going to turn against the Philistines or whatever. But nevertheless, while he was away from Ziklag, we then see the mishap. Chapter 30 is about some of the other villages get together and come and capture Ziklag, burn the walls, capture the spoils. They pillage that village and take away their wives and their children. And when David returns back, he sees the city of Ziklag burning. And it says in chapter 30, verse 6, David was greatly distressed. And then the very last chapter of 1 Samuel, chapter 31, is the misfortune. Israel's defeated, Saul and some of his sons are killed. Well, we want to deal with chapter 27. We want to deal with the topic of discouragement here this morning. I want to say a couple of things. Back in 2016, when I arrived here as pastor, not only when I was candidating, but when I arrived here as pastor, I preached a message one of the first weeks here, and the title of it was Causes and Cures of Discouragement. At that time, the church had gone through quite a bit. And again, I was not here, but knowing the things beforehand and certainly finding out more information once I became the pastor and talking to several people, I began to see the pieces of the puzzle fall into place a little bit more clearly of what happened. And back in 2015 even, there were some problems brewing up in the church and some things that were going on, and some families were leaving. And prior to that, there were some other issues as well. And in 2016, the pastor resigned. A couple of weeks later, unfortunately, he passed away. It was a very sad time for the church. And then the church began its process of looking for a pastor. And through all of these months and events, more and more people began to leave. And because of that, when I became pastor, I talked to several people, and they said, I asked them, are you coming back? And certainly I did not want to visit people who had already joined another church. I wasn't going to try to steal their flock. But for those who had left the church who were just wandering, I was trying to reach out to them and trying to get them to come back. And many people told me that they could not come back either because of the pain that it brought back memories, because they loved the church, they loved the pastor previous to that, or because of the problems that had occurred, or they just could not. It was not the same church. I heard that over and over again. It was not the same church. The church isn't the same. And in my mind, anytime there are changes, the church is not going to be the same. The church is not the same today as it was 9 months ago. COVID happened. This pandemic happened. Our whole church body is not together. It hasn't been for months. This past Sunday, 1 week ago, I preached a message, Reasons to Rejoice. That next day, Monday, I experienced discouragement, even after preaching that message. I began to look at the news, and I began, even as I was preaching last Sunday's message to an empty auditorium, I missed you. I missed the ongoing of the fellowship because of the pandemic. I missed what the pandemic was doing. And I had warned the church many times throughout this pandemic that I was scared or fearful for the lives of people, that they would get out of church and stay out of church. They would get into the habit of missing church. I was discouraged because of the news, of the pandemic, of the things that were going on politically with our country and the election, of the corruption that was going on, the violence, the distortion of people's believing one thing and it's not really the truth, the misappropriation of things. I was discouraged because we've already had one family officially leave the church, and I'm fearful that others are going to, or already have, or at least are away from the Lord during this time. And I got discouraged. And it would be easy to be discouraged. David was discouraged. What can we learn about this time? I want you to think about this, because in some ways our church is similar to what it was back in 2016 when I came as a pastor. The church was not whole. The church has been splintered. Today, our church is not whole. We're watching it degrade, if I can use that word, because people, for fear of the virus, for fear of getting together, are missing out on coming to church. And I understand it. I get it. I'm not saying I agree with it, but I get it. And I don't fault them. And some have really underlying health concerns and issues that if they did get the virus, it would be a problem, potentially. So I get the decision. But that doesn't stop the fact that I see that our church is not a whole body. We're like a body with a broken leg. And we're limping along right now. Our church is hurting, I believe, as a pastor. Our village is being pillaged by the enemy. And I'm as a soldier, I'm concerned. As a pastor, I'm speaking to our young people. I'm speaking to the family members who have not been here, or who have not been here and are starting to feel like they don't need to be. And for those of us who have been discouraged during these last several months. All of us have been, or are, or will be discouraged from time to time. David was discouraged. I'm going to give you 4 things quickly this morning. What discouragement did to David. 3 of them are negative, and 1 is positive. First of all, discouragement destroyed his perspective. Discouragement destroyed his perspective. For several years now, David had been fleeing from Saul. cave to mountainside, having the opportunity to get back at Saul, but did not. And David's idea was, he says in chapter 27, verse 1, I shall now perish one day by the hand of Saul. You see, David's focus got off the fact that he was anointed to be king, got off the fact that God used him to deliver the nation of Israel from the giant called Goliath. He got off the fact that God had used several circumstances to deliver him from the hand of Saul, the javelin that being thrown and armies being chased around the mountainside and such like that. And he forgot about all the blessings of the past. He forgot about the promises of the future, and he started worrying about what might be. And because of that perspective being lost, his perspective began to change. His decision making changed. And I'm warning us, much like David went through discouragement and it destroyed his perspective, that some of us are going to make some decisions, if we haven't already, that's going to destroy our perspective, that's going to allow us to see things from a jaded point of view, to see that the village of First Baptist Church is being pillaged, and then to make a decision like so many families did in 2016. The church isn't the same, so I'm going to leave. And they make the church not the same because they have left. And it was like a ripple effect. And I'm fearful that some people who have been away from church are going to have a perspective of saying the church isn't the same. And you see how this is a catch-22, because it's not the same. They're going to make a decision to make it not the same. Discouragement destroyed his perspective. Don't let discouragement destroy your perspective. Secondly, discouragement drove him to compromise. It drove him to compromise. Back in chapter 21, which I didn't even say anything about, but back in chapter 21, David acts like a crazy man, spittle on his beard and jumping on some walls and such, and he joins forces with the Philistines. Well, here, his answer was, let's do it again. And you know, folks, when we compromise one time, it becomes easier to compromise the second time. You ask any habitual liar, it became easier and easier and easier to lie. You ask a man who is a pedophile, someone who's saturated with lust, how did it happen? Well, because they lusted and then it lusted and it lusted, and it became easier to lust. And when we compromise, it gets easier to compromise. God warned his people over and over and over again, before this and after this, not to intermingle with the heathen. David's idea was to get Saul off my back, to ease up the problem in my life. I need to run away. I need to change scenery, to mix things up. The problem was that his plan became a commitment, and his commitment became a lifestyle for 16 months. And folks, I'm afraid for some of you that are out of church right now. Again, some are for good health reasons, and I get it. But if we're not careful, our plan becomes a commitment, and our commitment becomes a lifestyle. And we then will choose, because it's our lifestyle for the last several months, and however many months we still have left, of being out of church. And let me encourage you, don't get into that lifestyle of forsaking the assembling of ourselves together. You're commanded by God to not forsake the assembly. You're commanded by God. And so make sure that you are connected, not only with the Lord, obviously, but with his body. Discouragement destroyed his perspective. Discouragement drove him to compromise. Thirdly, discouragement directed him wrongly. You see in the next couple of chapters here specifically, but even in the next book, 2 Samuel, his attitude changes, his ambition changes, his action changes, his allies changed. He's on the Philistine side. And some of you who are out of church right now, if you're not careful, you're going to not be associated with the brethren so much. And you're going to look to fill that void using the smartphone, using the electronics, using the TV, using the world and that'll be your new crowd. And you be careful about being directed wrongly. God can use you in a mighty way. He can use situations in a negative way to draw you closer to Him. But don't you understand that the devil would love to use discouragement? The story is told of years gone by. The devil was trying to have a garage sale. He was trying to get rid of some of his old tools that he'd been using for several years and buy some new and improved stuff. And so he decided to advertise a garage sale, and he set his wares up on a table, long table, and he put a price tag on each one. Word got out, and eventually a gentleman came down the street and started checking out the items. All of them had been used quite significantly, much like what we would put old tools up for sale or something at a garage sale. But he came to the first item up for bid, and it said $500. And it was criticism. It was a tool that Satan had used through the years that certainly worked, and he valued that to sell for $500. Anger was $250. Sloth was $380. Jealousy was $630. Lust was $1,000. But out of this guy's eye, after viewing all of these tools that Satan had used through the years, he saw a beaten up, worn out tool. He went over there, checked out the price tag, and it said an exorbitant price of $12,000. The man asked the devil, "Why is this beaten up, used tool so expensive?" The devil replied, "Because this will work when nothing else will." He said, "What tool is so effective?" And he said, "Discouragement." And Satan has used discouragement through the years effectively as a tool to discourage us. I speak firsthand. I'm sure you do as well. Discouragement destroyed David's perspective. It drove him to compromise. It directed him wrongly. But the positive thing, in which I hope discouragement, when we do get discouraged, will help us. Discouragement drew him to his knees. It drew David to his knees. In chapter 30, verse 6, it says, David encouraged himself in the Lord his God. 2 verses later, it says, and David inquired of the Lord. After Saul's death in 2 Samuel, it says, and it came to pass after this that David inquired of the Lord. During that 16th month, I'm not sure we can find too much there where David is seeking God's will. But we certainly see that discouragement drew him to his knees. Folks, as First Baptist Church, the village, is being attacked by Satan, and churches like ours, but the village is being pillaged. And he's using different tools, including discouragement, including the pandemic, including fear, to harm us, to hurt our church. And I call upon every soldier to pick up the sword of the Spirit, to pick up the shield of faith, to stand strong, to stand still in the faith, and to be found faithful, yet and not only to stand, as the song goes, stand up, but also to take a knee, to bow the knee, to draw your heart closer to God during this time. May our church revive itself, seeing that the discouragement of life, the frustrations, the uncertainties, and the problems of life can cause us to be committed to God. He's done so much for us. Let's be thankful for Him. Let's understand what He's done for us in the past, what He's promised for us in the future, that He's here for us in the present. Let's draw nigh to God, and He will draw nigh to you. God, help us, O Lord, as our church is under attack. The village of First Baptist Church is being attacked, oh God. I fear for the outcome, where the dust may settle of what our church may be in another few months when the pandemic is over. But I pray right now, God, that we would understand the tactics, the devices of Satan, and what he's been using, as what he's currently using to discourage us. And now, as we go into this winter season of this pandemic going on and on again, God, may you help us to encourage ourselves in the Lord. May we understand who you are, what you've done, what you've promised, oh God, and how close you want to be to us. And may it drive us to pick up the sword of the Spirit, to pick up the shield of faith, and to determine to be strong soldiers for the cause of Christ. Lord, there is a battle waging, and God, we can't afford to lose the battle. Lord, to allow discouragement to defeat us, to disrupt our view, our perspective, to compromise. And Lord, help us to draw close to you. And Lord, I pray if anyone here listening to my voice, either whether they've attended church, Lord, today we're all separated from one another, but whether they have been to church recently or they've been out for quite some time, help all of us to draw nigh to you. You've been so good, and you want fellowship with us. We're so grateful for that. We lift up your name. We praise you. Help us, oh God, to draw close to you. Thank you for being a God who loves us. Help our church to be found faithful, because you have been faithful to us. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless you, folks. I love you.